Welcome to the Mental Mastery Breakfast for Leaders. Today I will talk about Sunil. Sunil was the CEO of a fitness company with many branches across the city and also in a couple of other countries. And one thing about Sunil, you can say pretty much everyone who knew him, who worked with him, loved him. He was just a very likable person. He was quite charismatic, and people really enjoyed being with him and around him. At the same time, the results of his leadership were not so good. The company kept being at the brink of bankruptcy. He managed to somehow to convince the banks to keep giving them more money to survive, but the business overall was not profitable. And when we looked closer into what was going on, it turned out that Sunil had actually two tendencies that are really not helpful if you are a leader, especially the CEO of a company. Number one, he was quite permissive, meaning he would let people who didn't perform as expected quite easily off the hook. He would ask a few questions and then kind of say, I understand, must be tough, try a bit better next time. And if you run an organization, leadership like that simply doesn't work, because there will be always some people who will take advantage of that. Secondly, he was quite self-sacrificing. He had big problems to say no. He would say pretty much always yes when anyone asked him anything, as long as he somehow could do it. As a result, he worked really long hours. He spent his weekends as well. Quite often, he was quite overloaded. And in an interesting way, his top leadership team was not as engaged as you would hope for in a team at that level. And when I interviewed all his team members, I found out that they actually felt often disempowered. Not only did Sunil say yes when people asked him for help most of the time, but also quite often when he saw someone struggling, when he say, hey, how is this going? And they say, yeah, I'm still trying to figure it out. It's quite tough. Then he would say, you know what? Let me handle it. I know how to do it. And so he would take it over and do it himself, which of course contributed even more to his heavy workload. And as a result, he had very little time to think and to step back and to really think about how to transform his organization so that it would become more profitable, more sustainable. He was just working like crazy and being the nice guy for everyone. Why are leaders sometimes like that? Now, I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not going to go to do very deep dive psychology on these kind of things. But in the case of Sunil, I did, as usual, take the Harrison assessment. We also did the 360-degree assessment to kind of get more feedback from his team members, from other people in the organization, and we even invited a few people outside the organization who knew him quite well. And the feedback was relatively consistent, and it was also quite in line with what we found from the Harrison assessment, which is not always the case. And these two tendencies that I shared before, to be highly permissive and to be highly self-sacrificing, were clearly visible in both types of assessments. At the same time, I wanted to know more, and there were two other areas that clearly stood out and that tie in with the mental mastery of concept. Number one, his self-esteem. Self-esteem is the combination of the willingness to improve yourself and at the same time to accept yourself the way you are. And in his case, his self-improvement was actually really high. However, his self-acceptance was fairly low. Also, when we looked at his stress management versus his self-motivation, and remember, stress management is a good indicator of emotional self-management. It's not the same, but I have rarely found people who are good at managing their stress, but poor at managing their emotions otherwise. It usually goes hand in hand. There are a few exceptions, but they are quite rare. And so he was actually in a stressed achievement status, meaning high self-motivation, relatively moderate stress management. And it was also clear if he would keep going this way, that he would be at risk of burning out eventually, if the company doesn't go bankrupt before that. And so it was a quite acute situation that we had to address. Because if he can't change and transform himself, there's very little chance that he will be able to transform the organization as well. And it was, in my mind, quite critical to help him find a way to hold people more accountable, to bring his team more in so that they can actually support him more rather than feeling disempowered. And so that together they could be much stronger, much more high performing, and ultimately hopefully get the organization into a much better shape. So let's start with the self-acceptance versus self-improvement. So having high self-acceptance, improvement combined with low self-acceptance makes for a self-critical tendency, like it was the case for Sunil. And so I found that people who are highly self-critical usually have one of two reactions when it comes to leadership. Either they are quite tough with other people, or they are too soft with other people. Very rarely do they find the right balance of being nice and tough. And in Sunil's case, it was clearly that he was too nice, too soft with other people. And if you think about it, the thinking goes a bit like this. People who are highly self-critical, they are usually quite tough to themselves. And so those who are quite soft, quite permissive, they think, yes, I'm tough to myself, but I can't do that to other people. And that thought might not even be conscious. It may just have been developing into an attitude. Likewise, those who are quite tough, almost too tough to other people, they have a thinking that I'm tough to myself, I can do that to you too. So you see, it can kind of go into quite opposite ways. But paradoxically, the best way to address that is by addressing the self-esteem issue. So how can we bring someone's self-acceptance to a higher level? I've developed a methodology over the last 10-15 years. I honestly don't know when exactly, but I found that this methodology is really very useful to develop someone's self-esteem, especially self-acceptance. So how does it work? Essentially, I bring them through three different stages: the past, the present, and the future. When we talk about the past, we talk about what do you regret from the past that you still regret today? It could be recent, could be a longer time ago. Something you did. And they usually don't have big problems to find something. And for example, Sunil would say, yeah, I regret that I didn't fire this person earlier because he was non-performing for so long and I gave him way too many chances. I said, okay. Now let's go back to the time when you realized that this person is not performing well, but you did not yet fire that person. What was going on in your mind at the time? And he said, well, at that time I thought I should still give him a chance, I should still support him, maybe my support was not good enough, and so on. And I said, okay, so in your mind it seemed to be the right thing to do, right? At that time. Not to fire him yet. He waited for a moment and he said, yes, that's true. So then I said, does it really make sense to regret that you didn't fire him earlier? Because if you would have known better at that moment, if you had a better choice, if you were clear, I need to fire him, then you would have done that, right? But at that time, it seemed you still need to give him a chance. So at that time, it seemed right not to fire him, even though today maybe you are smarter. Correct? He said, yes. Then I said, well, it does make sense to regret the consequences of what we did, but it actually doesn't really make sense to regret what we did. Because if we would have known it better, if we could have done it better at the time, we would have done something different, right? But to regret the consequences is useful. The consequence is that you had to spend a lot of money for a non-performing person. That's regrettable indeed. And that can serve to learn and maybe next time be more careful, be more critical. Should I really keep that person or not? Correct? That's useful, but to beat yourself up for it is actually not useful. So it took a little while for him to get that, but then I asked him the second question, which is about the present. And it's a bit of a weird question. Most people actually answer it in the wrong way initially, and it's a question that has actually only one logical correct answer. And the question is, can you be right now in this moment better than right now in this moment, no time having passed? And the answer must be a clear no. Funny enough, about 1/3 of the people say yes. And I asked them how. And they said, well, if I would know this, or if I could do that, or if I could learn this. I said, yeah, but to do that, you need time, right? I'm talking about right now, no time passing. And that's when they realize, now we cannot be better than now. Now we just are what we are. And so eventually he recognized that also. And then I asked him the easiest question about the future. Can you ever be so good that you can't improve at all anymore? And that, of course, was a clear no. And it was really interesting for Sunil to realize that, because then the next time when he started to beat himself up, he could stop himself and say, you know what? If I could have done it better, I would have. It's just for whatever reasons I didn't, and that's regrettable, yes, that I didn't, but I couldn't do it better, because if I could have, I would have. And with a few repetition, with a few reinforcements, that kind of started to become second nature, this way of thinking. And just to be clear, this is not about excusing mistakes or what we missed. It's about recognizing it, learning from it, and making better in the future. Also, when it came to saying no, I found that once he started to have a healthier self-esteem, it also became easier to say no when people made requests to him. One important question I asked him was, how helpful is it actually when you are helpful? And that question actually made him think quite a lot, and he eventually realized that quite often it was actually not helpful in the way he tried to be helpful. And that started to ease the load on him over time. We had, again, to go through numerous iterations till it really became second nature. But once he started to transform himself, he started to change how he led his team, and the team was held more accountable, and the team was actually more engaged. And eventually they could also figure out a better way how to run the organization that is more sustainable, more profitable, so that they wouldn't keep running at the line of bankruptcy. If you enjoyed this Mental Mastery for Breakfast, for Leaders Breakfast, feel free to subscribe and watch out for our next episodes. And I'm always curious to hear what you think. What do you do with leaders who are too nice? Have you ever experienced that? Let me know in the comments section.